Good evening, everybody. A very, very warm welcome to this, our first in the Asia Pacific Outlook series. My name is Martine Letts, and I'm the Group CEO of AsiaLink, one of your co-hosts this evening. The University of Melbourne acknowledges the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we work, learn, and live. The Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, and Bunurong peoples, the Yorta Yorta Nation, and the Dja Dja Wurrung people. We pay respect to elders past, present, and future, and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. Once again, a very warm welcome to the inaugural Southeast Asia Oration. This is the first event of the University of Melbourne's Asia and Pacific Outlook series, co-sponsored on this occasion by the University's Melbourne's AsiaLink and the Asia Institute. And just a couple of words about both of us. AsiaLink has been around for more than 30 years now, and we are Australia's only national centre for Asia capability and engagement, working towards one goal: to create a better future on where Asia and Australia thrive together in our region. We provide insights, expertise, capability, and connections across arts and culture, business, education, and diplomacy. We build networks, we deliver programs, forums, and research that support and promote Australia's ability to engage with our dynamic and rapidly changing region. We empower individuals, organisations, the business sector, and governments with knowledge and capability to engage effectively in our region and to engage with our dynamic and rapidly developing region. The Asia Institute is the home of studies in Asian languages and societies at the University of Melbourne. Its academics are at the forefront of research into the intellectual, legal, political, economic, cultural, and religious traditions and transformations of Asia and the Islamic world. Asia Institute publishes a quarterly journal, the Melbourne Asia Review, of which hard copies are available tonight, and I hope that you've helped yourselves to that. I need to advise you that this evening's procedures will be filmed and recorded, and if you ask a question in the Q&A, your voices will be recorded. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce Professor Michael Wesley, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Global Cultural and Engagement at the University of Melbourne. Michael will provide some welcoming remarks, launch the Asia and Pacific Outlook series, and introduce our guest of honour and keynote speaker tonight. Thank you, Michael.
Many thanks, Martine, and welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here tonight, and it's wonderful to be launching the Asia and Pacific Outlook series here at the University of Melbourne. We thank AsiaLink and the Asia Institute for your collaboration in helping us with this major event. The University of Melbourne aims to play a leading role in interpreting the defining dynamics and events in Asia and the Pacific, as outlined in our global plan, Advancing Melbourne Globally, launched earlier this year. This series, the Asia and Pacific Outlook series, seeks to increase the awareness of the University of Melbourne as one of the world's leading institutions of expertise on Asia and the Pacific, the world's most dynamic region. Through this event series, we aim to provide a foundation to foster debate and create awareness about Australia's place and relationship with Asia and the Pacific, focusing on issues faced by societies across these regions. We are looking forward to bringing together evidence-based discussion to address the specific challenges faced by the region to provide a focus on solution-oriented outcomes. We hope that you can join us for future events in the Asia and Pacific Outlook series, which will tackle various topics such as the climate crisis, digital transformations, and public health, bringing together our partners, alumni, students, academics, and members of our broader community. Tonight, we are delighted to have a very special speaker to launch the Asia and Pacific Outlook series and present the 2024 Southeast Asia Oration on the topic, The Future of Democracy in Southeast Asia. Mr. Pita Limjaroenrat, MP, is a Thai politician and businessman, and is currently a member of the Thai House of Representatives. Kun Pita has been involved in politics since 2004 and previously led the Move Forward Party, the most ambitiously progressive in Thailand's electoral history, to win a plurality of seats and become the largest party in the general 2023 election. He has also worked in the business sector, holding executive positions with the Boston Consulting Group and the CEO of AgriFood. Kun Pita received his education in New Zealand, Thailand, and the United States, graduating with an MBA from MIT's Sloan School of Management and a Master's of MPP at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Kun Pita, you are most welcome. You've honoured us by coming and speaking at the University of Melbourne tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Kun Pita.
Thank you, Professor Wesley, for that introduction. I think you're far too kind. But thank you for the invitation and the organization as well. Let me begin by acknowledging a few people. Obviously, Professor Wesley, Professor Hadis, Ms. Martine Letts, and also Mr. Macmillan, among other distinguished guests that's in the house with us tonight. But most importantly, the young, bright students of University of Melbourne for spending time with me today. And it's always absolutely amazing to be back in Melbourne, Australia after a long time. The last time I was here was about 20 years ago, but for several reasons that when I come back to this region, it's always absolutely amazing. Personally, as Professor Wesley mentioned, I grew up in Hamilton, New Zealand. So obviously we have some slight differences when it comes to rugby preference, but hopefully we can sort that out. But my younger brother, on the other hand, went to Adelaide. He went to visit me in the 1990s in Hamilton, and he saw the stark contrast between Bangkok and Hamilton, and he negotiated with my father, and he ended up in Adelaide. At least they had a lot of penfolds during the time, so that's why I also had to stop by Melbourne and take a road trip together with my family to see my brother. So, once a down under, always a down under. I'm dying for some Vegemite, some Marmite, steak and cheese pies, maybe probably going to the record store and get some Crowded House and Silvershare Frog Stomp or something like that. I see some faces nodding and some blank faces at the back. So it's obviously we have some generation gap over here. But professionally, to be, the leader or the former leader, still in the leadership of the largest political party in Thailand, to come back to Melbourne exactly, where the ASEAN Australian Summit just happened 4 months back. I was listening very carefully to what your Prime Minister and what your Foreign Minister had to say. So it's really the right place professionally for a politician from Thailand to be here discussing the topic of today's discussion. But more importantly is punctuality-wise. I mean, after 20 years that I left this region and returned home and then spent some time in North America, I returned to Melbourne, Australia this year, the ultimate election year. 60 national elections in a year, where half of the world population is going to the polls. I don't know about any of you who's following UK election. Will probably have to return home and see whether it's really the end until the whistle blown, like what the Prime Minister said this morning. Also, what's happening in France last week, and also, we're waiting for that American election in November as well. So I think, personally, professionally, And punctuality-wise, I mean, it's a very good place and a very good day for me to be back here in Australia. Now to the substance. I think that the topic, as Professor Wesley said, is about the future of democracy in Southeast Asia. I think the first thing I would do is to change the name of the topic. The topic should be the future of democracy in Southeast Asia and its implication to Australia. That's what universities taught me when I was a public policy student. When you speak, you think about the implication of the audience. So if that's okay with you, that's really the goal of today's speech. The future of democracy in Southeast Asia and its implication to Australia. If that's really the objective of today's topic, speech, of my talk, then logically I would slice and dice it. I would structure it into 4 parts, and I'll tell you why in a minute. I think the first part will be exactly what the topic is asking me to do without dodging, is to talk about the future of democracy in ASEAN and what it means to Australia. It's an inside-out perspective to you guys. Then the second part should be, Australia and why it matters to ASEAN, an outside-in perspective. You see what I'm trying to do? The first part is inside out. The second part is I'm telling you a reiteration, a reflection of what I've heard from you guys as a second part. The third part, I'm going to combine both 1 and 2 to become the synergistic benefit of what ASEAN and Australian advantage is. Why we should be leading in the middle. What our partnership means if we are aligned on the future. And then the last part, which is the fourth part, is to do a gap assessment of that's the end game. Number 3 is the end game of what we wanted to achieve. But then we have to be realistic and look at what we have now and see what those gaps are and the call to action 1, 2, 3. And I think, we'll be comprehensive. And I think, I don't want to be a one-way communicator telling you, the story just how I see it, but I want you to get involved. I want it to be a 2-way conversation. It's going to be concise and crisp because we have all these panels waiting for us. So you can also ask me deep dive question in whichever you wanted to hear. So let me go to the first part on the state of democracy in ASEAN. In a sentence, the answer to the future of democracy of ASEAN is that it's new, it's young, it's critical, and it's complicated. And I'll tell you bit by bit. New is because 6 out of the 10 leaders in ASEAN is brand new. They are rookie leaders. From Singapore to the Philippines to Thailand, they just got their job for the first time. That's new part. They're younger. So if you take the average, apart from Brunei, Myanmar, and Indonesia, and you take the average age of these incoming leaders, they're 2 decades younger. I mean, if election means governance in Thailand, I'll be the youngest. And I'll bring the mean down, even more than 2 decades. But that's not the case in Thailand, so that's why I'm in the opposition, even if I got the most votes in Thailand. I came number 1, but I became opposition leader. But what I'm trying to say is, at face value, superficial level, if you look at ASEAN from Australia, you see a revival of leadership. Someone new, someone younger by 2 decades on average, and probably a good opportunity for a change, a more progressive way forward for ASEAN at face value. Now comes to the critical and complicated part. The way I would do it for you so that you think along with me is I'll do this in an analysis of opportunities and threats. Opportunities for ASEAN is a thriving economy. So this year, ASEAN grew by about 5%, by comparison to the world at about 3%. Vietnam grew by 6 point something percent. Indonesia 5 point something, Philippines 5 point something. I can't say that for Thailand. We will probably grow by about only 2%. We are the slowest growing country in ASEAN. The second largest and the second slowest. But overall, it's what I'm trying to say. Like on average, collectively, ASEAN is a growing region of about 5% compared to the world of 3%. China just announced its growth, and they're saying they're growing by 5% as well. So that's the opportunity for Australians, the business sector, to be thinking about this. Opportunity number 2. The economy is thriving, and the population of 650 million is relatively young and active. The average age of ASEAN population is 28 years old. What is it in Australia? 38. So on average, the market, the labor workforce, we're about 10 years younger than you guys. I think that's a clear opportunities from, inside out perspective of all the investors and all the trade partners when they come and they want to have an alternative to their indispensable trade superpower, then they probably want to look at ASEAN. Now, that's the opportunity part. The challenge part, I divided into 2 parts, which is the collective challenge and the individual challenge, because we're a 10-nation association. When we talk about challenge, we have our own challenge, but collectively we also have something. The first thing is definitely Myanmar. And while we welcome, your Australian-owned Special Envoy Julie Bishop to add on to lots and lots of special envoys in the past 30 years, she'll have a hard job ahead, and we're willing to very much looking forward to working with her. But there's nothing hopeful for me to report to you guys in the past quarter. I've been very clear to the Thais and to the international community, the international media, that as a prime ministerial candidate, it's important for me to understand diverse and comprehensive views. So to engage the ANC, to engage the NUG, to engage the EROs, which is the ethnic groups, in order for me to really understand what's going on inside, so that I could formulate a strategy that's beneficial to Myanmar as well as Thais as well. But the 5-point consensus that happened maybe 3-4 years ago never materialized. And the number of IDPs, internally displaced people, has reached 3 million. That number was about 200,000 before the coup. So 10x within 3 years. That's what's happening in Myanmar. And the report of the UN would say that about 90,000 people, refugee into Thailand. But when I check with the parliament, that number is 300,000. So 3 times of what it is in the moment. And, I've been talking to the foreign minister of NUG, various ministers of NUG in many parts of the world. The EROs, if I get a chance, if they want to talk to me, I want to talk to them to really understand, because we are the frontline states. So what's happening over there when there's a spillover, it impacts my country, so I need to engage them. And, the dynamics might be changing a bit. The military junta might be losing some ground, but they are really ramping up in terms of their manpower through military conscription. And it's a shame for me to report that the United Nations said that the Thai banks are helping the military junta with the financial assistance, as well as arm deals that's coming from Thailand. So what we are doing now in the parliament is to use the Foreign Affairs Committee to really call in UN and to call in all the Thai banks into the parliament and do some investigation, because we don't want to be complicit in this crime against humanity. It's a non-interference, that's okay. But for Thailand to allow financial institutions to whitewash money into military junta in order to buy weapons and kill the innocent's life. 7 million of children are hungry. I mean, the Australians should know, because you're the 3rd donor into Myanmar after Japan and European Union. But the situation is really testing the credibility and the centrality and the relevancy of ASEAN, whether we could do something rather than bullet points. That's the collective challenge, number 1. Number 2 is definitely the South China Sea. the maritime navigation, why Thailand is not a claimant of South China Sea, but it's about rule-based world order. It's about going back to UNCLOS. It's about following up on the code of conduct in ASEAN. And I think Indonesia last year tried to discuss about this situation once again, because it's not so long ago that it was June 17th. The entire region was very anxious. And then I heard it with my own ears in Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore that, there could be an accident that could lead to a potential war, which could lead to a potential disruption of where 40% of the petroleum products go through. 65% of China's trade go through South China Sea, 42% for the Japanese. And if some accident happens, if there's no guardrails to prevent all these escalation, which didn't happen, so we have to thank Beijing and Manila for de-escalating the situation. But if something like that happens, trade flows will get disrupted, just like what happened in the Red Sea, and all the shipping costs will have to go up. So it affects the entire world collectively. Challenge collectively, number 3, is the greater Mekong sub-region. I understand we have a couple of Laotians here in the house as well, so you know what I'm talking about. Greater Mekong sub-region includes 4 countries: Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. So 4 countries where we are more of a midstream and downstream, which gets impacted by the upstream. They do dams upstream. So when they do dams upstream, that means, when we're a midstream and downstream, that's when our farmers get into trouble. That's when biodiversity gets into trouble. That's when the fishermen gets into trouble. So then that's why we got together and we formed a Mekong River Commission, 4 of us, and trying to negotiate as a bloc. It's also where the contest of international power happens also. It's the Americans, it's the Chinese, it's the Indonesians, South Korean, Australia, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister just announced the water security of 222 million Australian dollars. So really appreciate it, so that all these countries will have an alternative when it comes to water management, rather than relying on people upstream, which is the Chinese. Or we also have to blame ourselves also that Thai companies or Lao companies are doing dams along the Mekong River, and they totally ignored the international law as well as the people downstream. So these are the challenges that these new leaders will have to face collectively. It will test the credibility, it will test the centrality, it will test the relevancy of ASEAN together. But individually, they also have their own problems. Take me for an example. My name is Pita Limjaroenrat. I'm the former prime ministerial candidate, 2023 election winner, and a parliamentarian at risk. Just to say that in a sentence, it explains the situation in ASEAN politics and ASEAN democracy quite a lot. I mean, we campaigned, we won 40% of the votes, we came number 1, 40% ahead of number 2. We formed a coalition of 312 out of 500. So that's a comfortable majority. And we got blocked by the appointed senators, by the military appointed senators, 9 years after the military coup that happened last time. By the way, Thailand became constitutional monarchy in 1932, so that's almost like 100 years. We've had successful 12 coups. So if you do a quick math, I don't know if there's scientists here, if you divided 100 by 12 successful coups, that's 7.5 years on average that something like this happened. We are talking about, as I speak, the Constitutional Court is receiving the complaint from the election committee to dissolve us. This will be the 5th vicious cycle of independent organizations dissolving political parties in the past 20 years. So destroying opposition. And you all know, you and I, we all know and agree that the health of democracy is not measured by how absolute, how powerful the government is, but it's about how robust the opposition is, how active and robust opposition in check and balance so that the government moves in the right direction. But dissolving opposition parties seems to be a pattern in Southeast Asia, not just in Thailand. If you think about Candlelight Party in Cambodia, that's one of them. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to speak about myself, but showing you the pattern in ASEAN. We're seeing, these fresh, supposedly new leaders coming in. Either you call that a succession plan or dynasty politics, last name politics. A lot of countries are running politics like it's family business. You can probably think of a few countries apart from Thailand where daughter of former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra is leading the second largest party in Thailand. You're probably thinking about Cambodia. You're probably thinking about the Philippines, Laos. I happen to understand that the Prime Minister, the father used to be the Prime Minister also, which is not a problem. I mean, if you think about Canada, if you think about Shinzo Abe in Japan, Bush, and things like that. But it's not really doing well in any other parts of the world, excepting for this region where we have this new leaders coming in, but it's part of a family politics. And then the second part that is peripheral to that is proxy leadership. Whether the current prime minister or the current president is really pulling the strings, or they have to ask their parents, their father, whether the strategic direction should be this or should be that. Yeah, so that's what's happening in Thailand, but it's also happening in other parts of Southeast Asia as well. Corruption, arm twisting in judicial sphere for political advantage. That's, I got an undue suspension during my prime minister selection, 1 hour before the House will select whether I become the prime minister or not. I got a court order right on my table at noon, and then I had to walk out because I lost my parliamentary mandate and I couldn't go through the process anymore. It's not even like the first time I couldn't succeed, that's correct. But the second time I had my plan on how to lobby the upper house as well as to do the math at the lower house so that finally I could become the prime minister. But I didn't even get that second chance because of the undue suspension and the loss of parliamentary mandate. So when you talk about judicial branch and executive branch and legislative branch, it's not just Thailand, is it, Professor? So, yeah, so you mean I have 10 minutes left, or are you serious right now? I usually don't go for like 2 hours. Okay, I'll try to speed up. But what I'm trying to say is, what's happening in Thailand is not just in Thailand, but it's also something that's all over ASEAN. And that's, up to the new leadership of how they want to take their countries forward collectively to attack the collective challenge, as well as, for their own countrymen. The ice breaking needs to happen. I mean, I can feel it that there are incoming prime minister. They probably have to listen to someone else, but they got to be their own, and they got to ice break, and they got to come together to finally gain that relevance and confidence and centrality back, whether it's institutional, whether it's economical, whether it's geographical centrality of ASEAN. So that's only the first part that I'm thinking, that I'm trying to give you a broad base so that you understand what's going on in the region. Now the second part is about Australia to ASEAN. So in a short sentence is that I hear you, Prime Minister, and I hear the Australians when you became the first dialogue partner of ASEAN back in 1974, the New Colombo Plan in 2014, the White Paper in 2017, Comprehensive Strategic Partnership in 2021, and also the ASEAN Summit. So I've been listening. I've been learning on what you have to say and what you expect. I hear rule-based world order loud and clear from your summit. I hear maritime freedom. I hear strategic balance and resilience. I see, coming together for climate change and digital transformation. And it's really, public to public, but private to private as well, in the sense that our trade with you to ASEAN, ASEAN to Australia is about 15%. And our investment is about 5% of your total economy. So we can totally become an alternative if something happens, in the sense of our private-to-private partnership. We're behind the Chinese, the Japanese, and then ASEAN. Yeah, so private-to-private, we have something to offer to Australia as well. But it's more like the people to people. I remember Foreign Minister Penny Wong, when she said that 1 million out of the entire Australia would identify themselves as the heritage of Southeast Asia, and to have a Malaysian-originated Foreign Minister Penny Wong, it's a good signal and it's a good symbol of how Australians perceive ASEAN. Now, if that's point number one and point number two, and when you combine all of them, you have to imagine of what the Australian and ASEAN advantage would look like. And I would argue that it's the time for us to lead from the middle, to really make the concept of the middle power a reality. And if it's, it's been very hard for the middle powers. It's been around, if you're in academics, probably 10 to 20 years that people have been talking about this. But if there's any partnership that come close to a reality, it would be Australia and ASEAN, because we are a natural partner of choice. We're at the same strategic ecosystem, the same strategic nexus. We rely on one superpower for security. We also rely on one superpower for prosperity. It's like how do we think about coming together for our collective competitive advantage? So it's not just national competitive advantage, but collectively, what's our competitive advantage that it gives us the strength not only to rebuff illiberal behavior, but have the ability to withstand the consequences as well. And also to have that apparatus to bridge between a divergence of two superpower. Like while we all eagerly await for the election result in November, we all have our various scenarios and the implication of what it could happen to us. Will there be a reversal of policy, like how TPP was reversed? Will we have to collectively pay for protection, NATO? Will we see a more severe trade war retaliation? One country slap on the other one strikes back, and that it impacts all of us? Will we see a superpower that would weaponize economic relations? That's all possibility that could happen between the rivalries, but that it will impact all of us in this room. At the same time, while we wait for the third plenary that will happen in 11 days, where the Chinese leaders will talk about their economic policies, they will talk about their technology sufficiency, and while we worry about the overcapacity, because I told you in the very beginning that GDP of China is 5%, but if you look in the details, the devil is in the details. It's no longer the same structure. It's more manufacturing based. And that stagnation and manufacturing base, that becomes overcapacity, and that's where the spillage would come into ASEAN. It will come to us, Australia, for price war. And that's why you started to see some tariffs slapped on it, whether it's from Europe, from America, or from Indonesia as well. So that's something that we have to eagerly await on both sides on what's going on in the future. But what about our own agency? What about our own ability to selfly determine of what we can do together? If we can't race with the American supremacy when it comes to semiconductor, or the Chinese. We can race them when it comes to electronic vehicles or semiconductor or AI. But together, when we join, we hold more than 70% of nickel production. And that's a raw material for batteries and solar panels and all those important things in semiconductor. Food security. If Thailand and Vietnam join together to become the top rice exporters in the world, and you're probably number 5 in terms of wheat producers and dairy and beef. If something of an emergency happens when it comes to food security, when it comes to raw material, when it comes to mining economy, that's our collective competitive advantage to the world and what we can offer. It's like way more than what the Chinese can produce when it comes to nickel if 3 of us combine, maybe 5 times or 6 times more than them. We are each other alternative. Australia is ASEAN's alternative if we want to do some friendshoring, if we want to do some de-risking, and vis-a-vis, vice versa. I mean, we're number 3 now, we could be number 2 in the future. I mean, if the leaders get together and really start thinking about the right, economic prosperity between us, to make sure that, it's not just, indispensable trade partner, that it's an economic necessity or security necessity that we need to rely on at the same time. This is the case of a possible middle power that comes in the region. That's a partner of choice. It's not binding by religion or by any other things. It's about values. It's about the way we think about the world together, and that could be a case for a real middle power to emerge. Lastly, I know you're a bit anxious, and he's a bit anxious too. He's like trying to keep you down. Oh, no more. Okay, I'm gonna finish. So, what I've done is I've painted you the picture of inside out, and then I talked about outside in, and then I talked about when I combined the two to find that synergistic benefit of 2 regions. Now, if you're convinced and we wanted to make it happen, what are the missing links? What are the missing steps? That's what I'm going next, and then I'm going to conclude my talk. It's really about the ASEAN leaders, the new younger leaders, to do their part to stop the fragmentation of ASEAN, in order to regain that centrality, the historical achievement of the reason why it exists in the first place, the mission of why it exists in the first place 50 years ago. And also the relevancy. There was a poll research asking younger generation of ASEAN of what ASEAN means to people of Laos, what ASEAN means for people of Thailand, what ASEAN means for Singaporeans. The result of those younger generations say less than 20%. They couldn't give a hoot about what ASEAN is about because we couldn't get things done. We are not relevant and we're not credible. We get together for meetings and we have that 5-point consensus comes out and nothing gets done. So I think in the short term, if the leaders are really care about how to move forward, that 5-point consensus has to be changed to 5-year roadmap. 5-year roadmap that talks about the right amount of pressure and incentives for the people of Myanmar to get together on the negotiation table. It's about restructuring ASEAN approach. Otherwise you have Laos for 1 year, then you have Indonesia, before that you have Cambodia, before that you have Brunei, for 1 year each. There's no continuity. So it's time for Troika. The previous one and the future one and the current one get together for some continuity. Thailand needs to get involved because of our proximity with Myanmar. We share about 2,700 kilometers with Myanmar. So we have proximity of asset and proximity of liability when it comes to this. The Indonesians can say what they want, the Singaporeans too, the Malaysians too, but if the Thai people or the Thai government does not get involved in Myanmar, 5-point consensus will be 5-point consensus forever. It's not going to be a roadmap. So I've been using the parliamentary system as the leader of, not the leader of opposition, I mean the leading opposition party, to do a no confidence debate with the Prime Minister and tell them, you got to set up the inter-task force within Thailand and really have to start off with like humanitarian nexus or humanitarian corridor in order to release the suffering of the people of Myanmar. And then you started to move on, work on with the people of ASEAN and all the partners in order to finally, help without interfering, so that the fragmented groups of Myanmar can imagine what post-conflict Myanmar would look like. That's what I'm trying to get at. Or risk balkanization, because some told me federation, some told me confederation, some told me like United States, because they have different resistance group. I think, if the dynamics are coming towards the resistance, and then there'll be a probability of democratic roadmaps in Myanmar once again, I think this is the right time to really start thinking about what it looks like post-conflict. Because once you can imagine that post-conflict Myanmar, and you work backwards, we'll be able to get Myanmar out of the crisis, the turmoil, or the upheaval quicker. That's the short term. That's what the ASEAN needs to do in order for us to work with you to become the middle power that we desire. The second, or the more of a medium to long term, it's time for us to really think about the role of ASEAN in terms of the Charter. The Charter was introduced in 2008, and it has to be a living document. We really need to start about that, non-interference, but not indifferent. And non-interference is understandable, but when 7 million children are suffering of hunger, and we do nothing, we're indifferent about all these suffering in the country, it might be time for us to really think about the Charter once again. Get together, get a consensus, but actually just start talking about it, of what it means to be a member of ASEAN in terms of the Charter, in terms of the rules and regulations. Revise the structure in the sense that, that 1-year term, it could be 2-year term or 3-year term, so that there's continuity. Think about the model of ASEAN minus X, because we work on consensus and consolidation building and all that. It will move very slow, but ASEAN minus X on a certain issues might allow us to be able to move faster. Revise the role of the Secretary General, so more of a general, not a secretary. More on decision making and less of a coordinating. But in order for us to do that, we really have to revise and think about the role, and probably have to think about financing in terms of ASEAN Fund. We probably have to make it sufficient so that the Secretary General has some teeth in him or her. ASEAN law, transboundary haze, for example. If you have a Clean Air Act in Singapore, in Thailand, but Cambodia doesn't have one, Myanmar doesn't have one, the transboundary haze and pollution is not going to go away. That's something that at the ASEAN level could be done. Disaster relief is nothing new. I think Malaysia introduced it in 2015, but people stopped talking about it. But if we get together, that's probably more on a security part that becomes quite an organization when we talk to you about AUKUS or Quad, for example. So if these things are done, I think we have the higher probability of being the ASEAN that we are supposed to be, and also to work with Australia to become, the convincing middle power that the world greatly needs this year. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, Wow. Peter, you've given us a hell of a lot to talk about, and the person who has the honour to moderate the conversation is Professor Michael Wesley, whom I'd like to invite to join you on the stage. Thank you so much for that extraordinary overview and for all the different perspectives. You've given us a lot to think about and to talk about, and so it is just now my role to invite the other distinguished panellists to join us. Dr. Anna Dziedzic, if you'd like to come and join us, she's Program Officer, Asia Pacific Regional Office at the Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance at the University of Melbourne's Law School. Professor Veli Hadiz, Director and Professor of Asian Studies at the Asia Institute, University of Melbourne, our co-host for this evening. Dr. Hong Lee Tu, the Deputy Director, Asia Program of the International Crisis Group and Chair of the Australian Vietnam Policy Institute Advisory Board at RMIT. And last but not least, Ms. Sim de Leon from the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne. Thank you, Michael.
Martine, thank you. And Kun Pita, let me thank you for your fascinating address. I think everyone in this room can understand exactly why your party won 40% of the votes and why your opponents had to resort to judicial injunctions to stop you becoming Prime Minister. I'd like to broaden the discussion tonight to build on Kun Pita's remarks, really to talk about democracy in general across Southeast Asia. And Vedi, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to ask you, you are a specialist on Indonesia. We've seen, we're about to see a transfer in power in Indonesia. How has the change of government in Indonesia, or how will the change of government in Indonesia impact democracy in Indonesia, but more broadly in Southeast Asia?
Thanks, Michael. So, as many of you will know, Indonesia undertook a change from an authoritarian government to a more democratic one since 1998. And the process has been lauded internationally, such that Indonesia has been congratulated as a country that successfully undertook a democratic transition, and moreover, celebrated as one of the few Muslim majority countries that has a working democracy. Now, I have to say that a lot of the congratulations have been rather exaggerated in that there are many, many flaws in Indonesian democracy. There always has been. It has always been run by what I have called an oligarchy, basically sort of alliances between politico-bureaucratic and big business families that have been able to colonize Indonesian democracy. Now, having said that, though, the symbol of Indonesia being democratic, I think, has been powerful, in spite of the reality, the flaws in the reality. Now, the thing is that we had a president for 10 years who also was celebrated as the first president who did not come out of the new order sort of entrenched elites. And he had a lot of support. He still is very popular, 75% approval ratings. However, he has also, in his last term, become increasingly authoritarian. And in many, many ways, actually, he has paved the way for a centralization of power, domestication of civil society, curtailment of criticism from the press and all that, which will be very, very warmly welcomed by the new president, Prabowo Subianto, who is a new order era authoritarian inclined general. So the irony is that Indonesian reformasi, Indonesian democracy, led by a non-new order person, has actually opened the door for a person who represents, the core or the heart of old New Order authoritarianism. So that in itself, I think, degrades the symbolic power of Indonesian democracy, and that will have a negative effect on democratization in the region because the model has been degraded. And in fact, global models have also been degraded, as in America and Europe and so on. So that just makes it, I think, increasingly difficult for democracy movements in Southeast Asia.
Fascinating. Thanks, Betty. Kun Pita, I'm going to do a segue to you because, of course, one of the great factors in Prabowo's success was social media and the effective use of social media. Can you reflect on what role social media is playing in either the democratization or the threats to democracy in Southeast Asia?
Pros and cons. I mean, pros is that during the campaign, for example, we could reach our constituencies easier. We could do our campaign management and strategic communication easier. But the threat is the misuse of social media, information operation, fake news and all those things to, assassinate characters. And that's also the negative side of it. And I think it's time for governments to start thinking about transparency of algorithms when it comes to social media, because it will become more polarized and more polarized. Once you hit on that clip, it will automatically lead to more clips about that situation, and then it could get worse. More than social media, asking for transparency when it comes to algorithm, so that everybody can know what kind of algorithm they do to us and to our children. I'm thinking about artificial intelligence now, because social media is quite yesterday when it comes to politics and campaign management. Is about artificial intelligence and politics. How do you think about this, and what's the morality, what's the moral compass on how you use artificial intelligence in politics? That's more of the right question on the next campaign going forward.
Anna, I'm going to jump over to you. You're a law scholar. We've seen constitutional courts play a key role in recent Southeast Asian politics, including Indonesia and now in Thailand, as Kun Pita talked about. What effect are these courts having on democracy, and to what extent are they promoting democracy?
Thank you, and thank you for having a lawyer join this conversation. I really appreciate the opportunity. So yeah, we've already heard some examples of how courts are getting increasingly involved in politics, and this is something that's happening not just in Southeast Asia, it's happening everywhere. The lawyers call it judicialization of politics. And, courts can play a positive role in this space. Having the option to take action in court under a constitution and hold leaders accountable under that constitution is an important part of democratic governance. And there are examples of that happening in the region. But there are other ways that democratic role has really become very limited. So one limitation is the quality of the law itself, right? Courts apply the law, and if the law is not democratic, that limits what the court can do with it. So some courts will get around this. They'll interpret the Constitution and they'll say this law is an invalid law. And we have an example of that from Indonesia earlier this year, where there was a law that kind of criminalised fake news and defamation. And the Constitutional Court said, well, that's unconstitutional because it's being used to criminalise freedom of speech, and target critics of the government. So we see a positive role that the court plays there. But on the other hand, we see courts becoming increasingly politicised. So also in Indonesia, we hear examples of courts favouring one side of politics over the other in different ways. One example, of course, is the decision of the Constitutional Court to remove the age barrier on presidential candidates, which opened the way for Jokowi's son to run for vice president in the recent election. So, and that case also raises a third issue, which I think is the degree to which courts are close to political interests or other elite interests like business interests or the military. So in that case, it was particularly controversial because the Chief Justice who sat on this case was actually Jokowi's brother-in-law. And of course, that Chief Justice was later demoted for violation of the ethics code, but the decision still stands. So I think that another limitation we see in the region is this closeness between courts and judges to those who are in power. Thanks.
Sim, I'm going to jump to you and ask you how trends in democratic erosion or growth in the region impact minority communities, and can you give us some examples of what might be happening in the Philippines?
Yeah. Overall, I think the impact for minorities and marginalized groups broadly has been quite detrimental insofar as those who seek to advance more authoritarian interests often move towards weakening institutions that are supposed to safeguard the rights of minorities, leaving them much more vulnerable to discrimination, but also abuse. And some have also resorted to rhetoric that vilify certain communities, blaming them as the sources of society's problem. And certainly that's what we've seen how it's played out in the context of the Philippines under the presidency of former President Rodrigo Duterte, who openly kind of disparaged human rights and championed a war on drugs that kind of built upon that rhetoric of homogenizing drug users as this dangerous others that needed to be dealt with. And we saw the detrimental impacts that had in terms of thousands of drug users being killed, majority of whom come from urban poor communities, so communities that are already in positions of vulnerability economically, socially, and politically as well. And I think that that's how it's played out in the context of the Philippines, but certainly the patterns of marginalization can also be seen in other contexts and on the basis of other identities, whether that's religious minorities, ethnic minorities, as well as gender identities as well. And I think what's worse as well in the context of democratic erosion is that usually it comes hand in hand with a crackdown on dissenting voices, which makes it even harder for people who are from marginalized groups that already face political barriers to keep fighting for their rights and to seek justice for their rights as well.
Thank you. Hong, I'm going to bring you back to some of the points that Kun Pita was making about the role of multilateral organisations like ASEAN and whether they have a role in facilitating democratic and accountable governance.
Thank you, Michael. ASEAN, obviously, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations that define the region, which we talk about 10 Southeast Asian nations. But in fact, by nature and design, is not to interfere with domestic politics. And the region which we know now, the 10 ASEAN countries, are actually designed to encompass different differences. So before the enlargement, before Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, Myanmar joined, it's of course was very diverse as well, but there was more commonality, arguably, to the ASEAN than it is now. So by design, it is accommodating those illiberal forms of governments and as accepted forms of governments in ASEAN. And because of that, it is bound to that non-interference, it is bound to embracing that diversity. And in fact, the applying member, who is not yet a formal member, Timor-Leste, of all countries comparatively in different indexes and accountability, has the best record in terms of democracy performance. So it is not to jump to conclusions that ASEAN is not really facilitating democratic governance, but there is that diversity that very few things that ASEAN nations can agree on these days because of that, those political differences at the foundation. In fact, if there's one thing that they agree on is not to interfere in domestic politics. That is something guarded by each and every individual. So it would be not welcome for ASEAN and institutions like that to facilitate, changes in in domestic policies. politics and governance. There are initiatives that ASEAN has, and there are some more successful than others. Of course, the criticism about ASEAN as institution has been since the day one of its existence. To paraphrase a way of describing ASEAN, institution is a shadow of a man, and men who are ruling ASEAN, unlike what we would want to see, like Pita, who has energy and ideas, there is a lot of acceptance to rituals, to things that are common and comfortable, not necessarily advancing processes, not necessarily future-looking. So that's why all the reforms that Pita mentioned had been in discussion for years in how to modernize ASEAN, but they go against the habits, the ritual, the comfortable way of doing business in ASEAN. So this is to say that ASEAN is not there. That's not the purpose of ASEAN. But there are things that ASEAN can do. For example, Pita also mentioned about the environmental initiatives. There are things that ASEAN does and does relatively well. For example, dialogues on advancing rights of women, children, minorities, migrants. These are things that ASEAN can do in terms of accountability. And in general, I think providing that opportunity and platform for transparency, dialogue, and of course, continuous commitment of ASEAN leaders to certain norms and standards of governance. And that is something very difficult because that commitment needs to be continuous and ongoing, which is not necessarily the case as we see in the current performance.
Anna, the variation in regime type that Huang was talking about, does that affect ASEAN's ability to act as a unitary and effective actor in places like the South China Sea and Myanmar?
Yeah, I think Huang's sort of answered some of this question already. I think it's an interesting question to think about because in the abstract, I don't think the differences in regime type necessarily matter when it comes to a country's foreign policy, right? You can think about democracies working with non-democracies, where their interests align. So it shouldn't, in the abstract be a barrier. The trick and the question is to find where those interests align. And, if you've got the complexity of the problems that Pita outlined in relation to South China Sea and Myanmar, you've clearly got interests that align. I mean, peace in Myanmar is critical, but, this how to get there problem comes up. So I think it's a very difficult question to answer, but Myanmar, I think it said a lot, is the test case for ASEAN, and taking some of the steps that Pita outlined in his talk might help get there. But I think, I guess another part of the problem is, countries that act in national interest, but also where self-interest and the self-interest of those elites in particular countries come into play. So we can all say, well, peace in Myanmar is in the national interest of every country, but is it in the interests of elites in various other countries who want to support the military, who want to promote their own business interests? So it's not just about governance. I think it's more than that. And regime type is one factor, but not the only one. Sorry, that's a non-answer to a difficult question. Thank you.
Pita, did you want to comment on that, or you were nodding vigorously?
Bullseye. Personal connection over institutional politics is part of the difficulty of how you move. But then I started with hopeful message that it might be hard in terms of the infrastructure or the hard side of things, but then again, if you have the soft side of cultural intervention, then it might be possible. But the thing is, you need a change of leadership, in the sense that you look forward in how you do things, not how you look in the past. Otherwise, it's either you disrupt yourself or you be disrupted.
I'm going to go off script here, and I'm going to go to where Kun Pita started his remarks, and on the youth of the region, the fact that Southeast Asia is a very young region and that it's got young leaders. So I'm going to ask Huang and Sim and Vedi each to comment on whether the youth of the region is a force for democratisation. Is this something we should be hopeful about? Why don't you start us off, Huang?
It's a very difficult question. I think it also really depends on, how do we define democracy really? Because we sort of have an idea that a democracy is a goal, we've reached it and it's all good. But actually it's an ongoing exercise. Even, the most shining liberal democracies are struggling with new challenges and new waves of challenges, including technology, which are very proliferated among young people. But necessarily also introducing disruption, including social divisions, polarization, and whatnot. So even in mature democracies, this continues to be challenging. So I think with the environment in Southeast Asia that was never really conducive to the type of liberal democracy that we have often in mind. I think there would be a double whammy challenge. One being obviously, the certain inherited patterns, be them the dynastic politics, patronage, and all kind of entrenched issues that deep running. And on the other hand, the new challenges that are coming, and we don't necessarily have any either solution or answer to that. And so we have both a regulation in terms of information because of the more authoritarian tendencies, but also lack of regulation when it comes to social media and technology. So those young people will be growing up in a very challenging environment, very hard to distinguish which norms, which way to go about and how to exercise the democratic rights if they get there, and how to promote that. So I think it's going to be if anything, it's more bumpy road ahead. I am also hopeful, like Kun Pita, when it comes to the potential of the region. And I think if we talk about democracy, we certainly have to talk about the developmentalism in Southeast Asia, and it's not by chance that Kun Pita started with economy and economic potential of the region. But does that necessarily translate into the form of governance, in the form of liberal democracy that we have known in the past decades? I think there's going to be a new form forming, some hybrid forms, more challenges ahead, and it would be up to young people to navigate. And I don't think it's going to be the answers that we had in the previous exercises of democracy may not necessarily be relevant. So it's a way to answer, Michael. I don't know. It depends on the young people, really.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely a challenging road ahead for young people. I think what I will add, though, is that young people have definitely shown their capacity to be that force. So much of the pro-democracy movements across Southeast Asia are being led by young people. So whether that be in Thailand as well as in other countries, they show a capacity where they introduce new energy into the movement, new ideas, new creative tactics for dealing with the crises that are ahead of us. And like, I've had the pleasure to be engaged with activists in the Philippines who are young. And while there is a great deal of anxiety about the future, there's also a great deal of desire to change that. And I think introducing that new energy and that new ideas, those new tactics, will be really crucial for the path ahead. I also think that they are in somewhat of a good position in terms of that digital age, insofar as so many of the youth grew up with technology. They have kind of more of a literacy and a savviness to navigate that. So I guess just to add a bit more hope into the discussion as well. But I do agree that it's absolutely so challenging and it will be a big work for young people across Asia and the world as well.
Thank you. Betty.
Well, I was telling Kun Pita this morning that I used to be a young democracy activist. Now I'm an old critic of democratic erosion. And I also, in our conversation in the morning, talked to Kun Pita about how many of my friends who were democracy activists with me in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Malaysia, in the Philippines, as they got older, got co-opted into the structures of power. So youth is a temporary transitional part of life. I think it's important that the youth have idealism when they are young, because otherwise when they are old, they will have no ideals. Okay, but I think it is very important to understand that the youth are not homogeneous. They sociologically, they are of different kinds of social origins, class background, education levels, exposure to existing social, political, economic networks. And therefore, one must, I think, be cautious about thinking of the youth as necessarily a progressive force. 71% of Indonesian voters reportedly voted for Prabowo. 65% of Generation Z voted for Prabowo, right? The slum dwellers of Manila, before they were hit by the anti-drug campaign, a lot of them supported Duterte. A lot of young Buddhists in Myanmar were mobilized to kill young Muslims. So I think we need to be careful about, sort of generalizing about the political character of the youth. But we were talking about algorithms and so on. I think it is important to recognize that the youth are also a precarious youth, right? In that, they are in socioeconomic structures where, like in Australia and the West, but in different ways, their futures are uncertain. And therefore, they tend to be kind of vulnerable or prone to actually be susceptible to those algorithms we are talking about, and therefore mobilize into all kinds of social political movements. Some of them are completely retrogressive. Some of them may be progressive, but some of them are completely anti-democratic and retrogressive.
Shouldn't we be asking the students, since they're already here, we're in the university campaign?
Are there any,
why
are there any
asking all the
students
oldies?
any students who've got views on young people pro-democratic or otherwise?
Or pro-security, yeah, kind of like that.
We'll be coming
Pro-prosperity.
We'll be coming to audience Q&A very soon, so please do think of your questions and issues you would like to pose. I'm now going to move to the issues of civil society, and I'm going to ask you, Sim, how have human rights activists and organisations worked to respond to democratic decline in the region?
Thanks for that. I think that, kind of trying to, there's been a recent acknowledgement of the close links between democracy and human rights, which has spurred a lot of action from a lot of human rights defenders, human rights activists, organizations, in trying to prevent further erosion in the region at least by highlighting some of the violations that can occur in a context where democracy is eroding. And that's been done in many ways by diligently monitoring and reporting on the different violations that do persist, mobilizing different allies that they can, either within local groups or within government circles and business circles, in order to take a strong stance on the issue. And of course, also working transnationally. So utilizing the international organizations, human rights organizations that exist, as well as international platforms like the United Nations and its different mechanisms, whether that's the special mandate holders or the Human Rights Council. Or also regional networks, because there are regional connections that exist within Asia and ASEAN that can be utilized as well, whether that's through pressuring national human rights institutions, through organizations like the Asia Pacific Forum, or connecting different activists together to exchange different ideas, like through formal networks like the Asia Democracy Network, or informal groups like the Milk Tea Alliance, for example. So highlighting one another's struggles, exchanging tactics, things like that. I think the main aim has been to just try to kind of highlight and put multiple pressure points for action, yeah, or if not action, at least perhaps to not let abuses that occur in those contexts go unnoticed, yeah.
Kun Pita, is grassroots activism, community campaigning part of the Move Forward Party's electoral strategy?
Oh, absolutely. It's like the foundation, it's like the core, and that's how we survive judicialization of politics. Because, I mean, in our movement, so I've been a politician. So I ran for public office, I want to say 6 years ago. This is my second party, so I'm the designated survivor. You know, the first one was called Future Forward Party. 8 months into the parliament, they dissolved. And then I became the designated survivor and led that for the first time as a rookie leader as well, and we won. The only reason why we could survive is that because we have strong foundation. So regardless of what the logo looks like, regardless of what the house looks like, the ideology continues and the membership continues, and a smooth transition can happen. So regardless of what happens in August, which is like about a month time, I mean, I could be banned for life. I could be banned for life. I can never run for public office ever again. That's a possibility. But with or without me, with or without my leadership, the movement continues because of the grassroots movement, because of the strong foundation. So we'll probably have to change the name. So Future Forward, Move Forward, Leap Forward, Jump Forward, you know, something like that. It will change. The logo might change. The color might change.
Could be Future Move.
Move to the Future Forward Party. But what I'm trying to say is that the political project continues, you know, and I often ask the question of whether I still have hope in politics or whether I still have hope in democracy, and how I remain optimistic is precisely because of the question that you asked the other panelists, because of the youth. Because I've traveled around the country, I've traveled to various parts of the world, and I see the young people who still very much believe in change, and they're fighting for their freedom, fighting for the change, in the sense that if they're 18 years old or 19 years old voting for the first time, they would have gone through 2 military coups in Thailand, 2 constitutional amendments, and a pandemic, and a military junta taking over economy, talking about artificial intelligence. So I feel like, you know, if we keep going the way we are going with the grassroots movement, as well as, you know, adequate policies, winning elections, as well as domination of ideas. I mean, winning election is just quantitative. I want to be 270, I want to be 300 out of 500 so that I can form the government. But then again, I'll hit all these apparatus that are going against me. It's about that domination of ideas, is about that collapse from within, just like how, you know, the mid-age liberal military in any other parts of the world felt like this is enough. I'm not going to militarize Thailand any longer. I'm going to give up and let the institution do the work. And I understand that democracy, it's zig and zag. But then again, it remains within that institutional found, and it will correct itself in the long run.
Anna, while we're talking about pro-democratic forces, could you talk about civil society in general, including academic institutions? Are they a pro-democratic force in the region?
Oh, they can be. Kind of go from grassroots to the ivory tower of academia. I think one way to think about this is to think about what democracy requires, which is an informed and knowledgeable citizenry that can hold a government to account. And so access to knowledge and freedom to produce and disseminate that knowledge, are critical to democracy. So civil society, including academia, but also the media, the kind of human rights organisations that Sim talked about, they're all part of this kind of process of democracy and the kind of practical way in which government can be held to account. So I guess this is why targeting of academia is often seen as an early sign of democratic backsliding. But it's also not for nothing that democracy movements are not only led by young people, but students in particular, right? So universities as a place where these ideas can be known and flourish and talk about is kind of critical to democracy movements as well. I think, again, these things are at risk, not just in Southeast Asia, but around the world. You can think about limitations on freedom of speech as applying to academics as much as they apply to others. But then there are other restrictions that I think academics face in particular. One way is talk about politicisation of the courts, politicisation of textbooks and history, and that kind of increasing interest by governments in what academics are doing and saying. I worked in Hong Kong for a while. There you've got textbooks literally revised to exclude, facts about Tiananmen Square, for example. And so, this is concerning, and it's not affecting only those academics who speak out and then are the target of the freedom of speech kind of restrictions, but also those academics who are simply teaching and researching. The presence of these threats can make them self-censor their work, and it really just compromises universities as institutions of knowledge. So I think these are challenges not just for the Southeast Asian region, but elsewhere, part of the story about democracy and its threats in the region.
Well, I'm going to ask about autocratic governments in the region like Vietnam. Is there any room for democratic activism in those sorts of regimes?
There's room for civic activism. Democratic activism wave, I think they're big words, especially in the Vietnam in the current context where you see certain tightening more rather than loosening of control. You might have heard in the recent news about the changes in the top leadership position, where Vietnam had been in the project of anti-corruption campaign of its own, where there are numbers of political arrests in high leadership positions, but also in business and corporate world included. And of course, there is more stronger control on the activists, including obviously the political ones, but even those who are activists in the environmental sphere. So the space is shrinking, is narrowing. Unfortunately, there are no good news now, but there is space there has to be some places where they let the steam out of the society. And I think one of the examples is actually in the activism for LGBTQ community in Vietnam. So that's one of the rather positive example. But since Michael, you've mentioned Vietnam, I think it's important to set the context because it's relevant for the whole region. Vietnam and what historically happened there really shaped the region, Southeast Asia, and one could argue that because of Vietnam, ASEAN came to place in the first place. The original four and then 5 ASEAN members come together because they didn't want the spillover of communism to the region, and then because later on they did include Vietnam, the region it is as it is today, encompassing those illiberal mainland Southeast Asian. But why I wanted to mention the historical context because of the relevance question that Kun Pita mentioned. So what for Australia, or so what for the partners in the region, right? So when I was born in very isolated Vietnam, post-war Vietnam, where it was basically punished by the entire world. It was diplomatically isolated. It suffers poverty or kind of bad things, but now it has integrated with the world. Nobody punishes Vietnam for the governance system that it has. Everybody wants to be friends with Vietnam. So not only the government can get away with what it's doing, it is accepted. And that speaks to diversity of ASEAN. That speaks to perhaps not very effective values-based foreign policy. And it is the world we have today, so we can't judge, foreign policy by dividing friends and foes. But at the same time, I think certain corners of society, certain groups of activists also feel abandoned because they followed that democratic activism pursuit and they're not supported as they would think they should have been. So this is a challenge for Australia as a partner, but for US and others in the region, while promoting that free and open Indo-Pacific. What kind of governance, what kind of relationship and partnerships in all aspects, whether economic, but also security and diplomatic. It is encompassing and embracing that diversity and respecting each country's and governance choice of their governance. But at the same time, there is a question of accountability, not only to the government that are tightening control, but also how do they respond to the civil society movements. These are really sometimes contradicting interests.
I'm going to ask a question of each of our panellists, if you could reflect on this one. On the one hand, you've got what's happening in the United States. You had the Trump presidency, you had, the January 6th, the signs that democracy in the West is in trouble. On the other hand, you've got China as an alternative model to democracy that explicitly holds itself out as an alternative model to democracy, a better model of governance, if you like. What effect are these two examples having on perceptions within Southeast Asia? Kun Pita, I'm going to start with you.
Well, democracy has been tested a couple of times in my lifetime when there's always risk of financial crisis. I remember 1997, that's Asian financial crisis, hamburger crisis. That's also when I was in America, and people were started to question capitalism and the American way of doing things. But then we got away with it. So when we talk about liberal democracy and institutions, we have to believe that the institutions will correct itself. I mean, if you look at some examples as miracles, it could go both ways. When it's like autocracies or autocratic governments, I mean, if you look in a couple of countries in the region or in Asia, then you might want to follow them and feel like if you have one strong leadership, like Lee Kuan Yew, for example, and the country will be prosperous and all. But then I'm thinking about, our African counterparts as well, that, is about a personal Superman that could rescue the economy and rescue the country as well. So it could go either ways. So I don't believe in individual person that could, rescue the country. It could happen. I mean, it happened before, but I still think in this, to prefer the system or the institutions that allows good people to get in and then attracts talent to get into politics, rather than relying on someone because that someone might be good this year, but 10 years later it might be of a different person, and it might not be the case that the growth will be indefinite by the case.
Who else has thoughts?
Maybe I can add on that, because I actually started with the transformation of Vietnam as one of the cases. But I think there is that debate about whether US is a better role model or China. I think necessarily this is very confusing way to put things, because yes, a lot of times it was portrayed so that US or the West, the liberal West, or the rich West was once upon a time the role model of economic development and political development that leads to open, prosperous societies. But I think there is also a narrative that is based on that currently now, seeing the disruption, the chaos, the polarization in the US, but also in Europe, what we mentioned, that is frightening for many, but also often used by those who are wary of democracy going out of control. On the other hand, China is not necessarily a shining example either. I don't think people necessarily would want to live in a society tightly controlled. Yes, maybe there are some that would admire its economic trajectory of China, but not necessarily would want to live in China. So I think that this kind of simplification does not necessarily work. And mind you that China, when we talked about developmental, Asia is actually latecomer. Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia had gone early and got prosperous much earlier. So there are a lot of things that actually China can learn from the region. And Kun Pita mentioned Singapore, and I think for a lot of Southeast Asians, Singapore would be the model that they want to see. Whether cat is black and white doesn't really matter. Matter that things work, that you have, good canalization, good jobs, and working public transportation and whatnot, governance and leadership of those in the position that take care of their people. I think this is what most of the people in Southeast Asia, who not necessarily spent their day job thinking about politics want. They want jobs, they want security, they want the country that is running well. And that's what the young people, that's why Singapore is so attractive to the entire region of Southeast Asia. And again, we can debate about nuances, okay? Next, a new leadership generations of Singapore, and it is whether it is even a replicable model, because it's a city-state, a small city-state in opposition to very, very big and diverse neighbors like Indonesia, for example. It's not necessarily replicable, but I think at the end of the day, we don't talk enough of what people want. In our old discussion, it's about ASEAN, which is intergovernmental institution, and so it is still, at the leadership position. And as Kun Pita mentioned, it had in 50-something years done appalling job in assimilating it to the civil society and young people and people in general. So there is no that ASEAN identity just yet. So it's just to say that the diversity of the region and people within one country in different regions, I don't think there's one model to be replicable.
I'd like to go next. Eddie?
Okay, well, I think that there would be few people in Indonesia that would get away with saying that we would like a communist party to be running the country. So that's not an option. But the attractiveness, of course, of China is that it represents an autocratic, more authoritarian model. And this talks to the sort of concerns and rhetoric and interests of the people who say democracy has gone out of control, right? And in fact, one such person is Prabowo Subianto, who a couple of years ago said that we should not have direct elections in Indonesia, and at one point said that democracy was not suitable to Indonesian culture. And I think that the success of China economically and, sort of its, adventures in Central Asia and Africa and so on is providing a model. I think there's lots of crackpot dictators all around the world who would be attracted to a model of, oh, we can have economic development and yet have authoritarianism, right? Now, the issue, though, is that in the history of all, of the countries in Southeast Asia, certainly when you've had authoritarianism, right? So Vietnam is about a bit of an outlier here because of its, particular history. When you've had that, hasn't power and economic wealth, sort of been concentrated into, the hands of very few people in a way that is against interests of people in general, and also lead to policies that in the long term would be unsustainable without democratic checks and balances? I think that's the issue, really. And I would say that really a lot of the people who say the autocratic model is the one that we should follow in Indonesia have an interest really in sort of destroying the environment and so on and so forth without a lot of public kind of controls over what they do. Now, the problem is that, when I was a young activist, even though we knew that there were problems in America, problems in Australia, in Europe, and so on, we could, as a matter of propaganda, say, well, this is, something, more like what we'd want things to be, sort of, or maybe Scandinavian social democracy, although it was never going to transpire. But these sorts of ideals being sort of put forward in the sort of war of propaganda. Now we can't do that. I mean, there is no model of democracy, a model where human rights are consistently being secured. You've got democratic crises in America, Europe, and you've got the treatment of refugees in Europe, Australia, America, in ways that completely go against the human rights principles that the West has kept on preaching to countries like Indonesia. So, how do you take that seriously?
Sim, did you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I think they raise really good points about like the issue of simplification of these two, the only two kind of alternatives. And I think what we can take, at least in the context of the Philippines, is how that narrative as well could be used, because Duterte's foreign policy was very much around US versus kind of China, right? So it was this idea that it gave him certain levels of legitimacy to commit the authoritarian practices that he was engaging in, because while the West would criticize him on the basis of human rights, he had the legitimacy to say, well, then I have China to lean back on. So I think that's the danger of that simplification as well, is if the West will critique us, then China will support us. And it leads to that idea that then is the alternative. That's the ideal then, if not the US and China. And I think there's also, I think a lot of scholars refer to like the Philippines as being quite disillusioned with democracy, and that's what gave rise to Duterte. And to some extent, I think democratic backsliding in the US has raised questions for people, emboldened in large part by the kind of rhetoric from politicians as well, to question, is that something that we do want to work for, if even in the West, it doesn't seem to be working out in the way that they claimed it to be, as ideal as they would like it to be. So I think it kind of feeds into that narrative.
Anna.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think from what the panelists have sort of said, the idea of models is not helpful. It's open to abuse. It's not all that useful to look to, what kind of model of democracy do you want to import and export or draw on. And so what do you look to instead? And one possibility is to go back to principle, right? What is a democracy? And it goes back to what Hong said about, what do the people want? And democracy is there to provide for the participation of the people on an equal basis in their government. What do they want? So I think the current circumstances of the world are kind of a challenge to organisations like my own to think about, well, what is democracy at heart, and maybe start imagining how that can be reimagined, whether that's reimagined for the United States, for Australia, or for the Southeast Asian region.
Thank you, wonderful panellists. Now, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, it's over to you. Are there questions that you would like to pose of any of our panellists? Pradeep. There's a microphone coming.
Question for Kun Pita. You painted a rather pessimistic picture of ASEAN and its ability to resolve problems in the region, and you particularly referred to Myanmar, its failure to achieve anything in Myanmar. My question is that we have a growing sort of competition, rivalry, whatever you want to call it, between China on the one hand and the United States, and more broadly Quad, despite the fact that you talked about Australia as a middle power, but Australia is also a member of the Quad and very much a United States ally. Given this growing competition, and a lot of people worry about the possibility of a conflict in the region, can we rely on ASEAN to play a role which the notion of ASEAN centrality really highlights? I mean, we all hear about ASEAN and all the major powers in the region, the dialogue partners of ASEAN, recognize the concept of ASEAN centrality. And all the institutions in the region are in fact centered on ASEAN. But given the pessimistic picture you painted of ASEAN, can ASEAN live up to the expectations that some of us have, that it could be that moderating influence in dealing with this growing competition between China and the United States?
I'm very conscious of your time, so I think how I would want to do this is to take rounds of questions. So maybe 3 questions at the time, whether it's to me or any other panelist, and then we answer in one go, and then we go to the second round, so that includes more people.
Sure. I think there was a question up here.
Yeah. All right, so I've got 3 questions for Kun Pita. It's past precedent.
I just shoot myself in the foot just now.
Sorry. So I'll summarize that. So it's kind of past, present, and future. So this one is focused on Thailand. What, in your view, what do you think? What have we been doing wrong for Thai democracy, and why are we still here? Okay. So for the present, this is maybe a bit personal. So with what you have done, and like with all the problems that, like with your case and with the Move Forward Party as well, what do you tell yourself like every day, like to keep fighting for this? And for the third question, for the future, so let's say what we discuss here, like the democracy might be, what in your view, what is a Thai blend of the democracy, and why would those stakeholders will accept these conditions?
Easy question.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe last question for anyone, and then I'll take a jab at all those questions.
Hi, my name is Thomas. I'm a student at Monash University and also on the Student Union, and I'm also an NCP scholar for the Philippines and fellow for ASEAN. My question is kind of a reflection on some of the professors, both professors' questions on young people, but also relating to Pita's own experiences. I feel that young people are not necessarily inherently pro-democratic or anti-democratic, but that we are truly fed up, that it just seems like things aren't working. And every time we're being told that this is the thing that we do, this is the party that we vote for, this is the group that we can champion, it just seems like the system works against every element of that, such as with Pita's experience with the complications of Thai democracy at times. What is the thing that you think you can tell young people to make them believe that this is still possible in the face of all of these really big structural challenges to the things that we want to be able to believe in?
Thank you very much for the question. For the first question is about pessimism and also about Quad, whether it will intensify rivalry in already a contested world. I started with opportunities. I started with opportunities in terms of revival of new leadership that could come in. So, starting from a very neutral ground on, the future is in the hands of all these new incoming leaders, whether they will, use their own assessment and strategic direction in order to make sure that they maximize the opportunities as well as coming together to minimize the threats. So it's not always the case, something if you really do the job that you're supposed to do, then it might not lead to a negative consequence all the time. In terms of Quad, I tried to take a look with a neutral view, and the last time the Quad meeting happened, it was about public health. It was about digital transformation. It's about climate resilience. Not so much about security as a lot of people perceived it. So devils is in the details, and I listened carefully. I'm not going to prejudge before something happens like that. And if that's the case when it comes to public health, when it comes to climate resilience, when it comes about digital disruption or aging society, very happy to work with Quad. And I don't think it's going to intensify any rivalry. Rather, it will come to collaboration rather. The three-question man, okay? What Thailand has been doing wrong. 3 M's. We've been militarized for too long. We've been monopolized for too long. And we've been centralized for too long. So 2 M's and 1 C. So militarized, you understand what I'm trying to say, the kind of military coups that happened and the kind of national budget that is being allocated to the Cold War era kind of defense rather than the new challenges. Monopolies is, the top 1% holds 69% of the wealth, period. In God I trust, the rest brings data. And in terms of centralization, Bangkok is Thailand, Thailand is Bangkok. Simple as that. What do I tell myself? Don't take it personally. What was the third question? You don't remember it yourself.
Okay, I'll repeat the whole thing. Okay, sorry. So if you think Thai democracy as a whiskey blend, so what would be the blend of Thai democracy, and with the key players, like the stakeholders, what would be the status of them and why would they accept those?
Single malt, baby, with a bit of ice because it's hot, and make sure it's pure. Power to the people. Okay, and the last one is about Rage Against the Machine. Like you guys are fed up, huh? All the Rage Against the Machine now. What I would tell you what if I tell you it's a ploy? It's an alibi for you to be fed up with politics and you feel like it's dirty. You feel like you don't want to spend time thinking about it. You'd rather take care of your own personal things and things like that. And you don't want to be in public service. And when you are really bored and tired of politicians fighting against one another, that's when they pass the laws to concentrate their wealth and give a bad name to politicians, and they give a bad name to democracy because of the inequality that comes with it. It's a kind of economy that doesn't work for everybody because of, the barrier to entry that is by the legal basis or the way they think about politics. Politics is very easy. It's who gets what when. Who gets what when? That's politics. So if you ignore politics, you're fed up and you don't feel like you want to give up, that's when who gets what when becomes the elite or the soldiers or the establishment. So no options. The rage you have, I understand, but use that rage to make some beautiful rock music to keep it going.
Okay, I think we've got time for a round of 3 more. Yes, please, the lady in the red scarf.
fact, thank you. You've mentioned a lot this evening about ASEAN, but you haven't touched on BRICS. And particularly as Thailand has recently shown their interest in joining BRICS. And as we know, China is the dominant superpower of BRICS. What anybody can comment on that? Thank you.
I think there was one just behind. Yep.
Hi, first I just want to say thanks, Pita and the panel, for the discussion. It was really interesting, and Michael for facilitating. My name is William. I'm a previous NCP and graduate of UniMelb. My question is, I guess one of my key takeaways from this conversation is that unifying Australia and the Asian region is really important for managing geopolitical pressures from the East and the West. We spoke briefly about synergies between Australia and the Asian region in terms of leveraging economic strengths with nickel to have a stronger voice in this region as a middle power. My question was, can we dive a bit deeper into Australia's role into this space as well in terms of how we could potentially have a more active role in supporting stability and prosperity within the region and then becoming a stronger middle power?
Thank you. And up the back there, thank you.
My name is David Navaratna. Thank you so much for the talk. My question concerns the role of party loyalty in relation to democracy. So Mr. Pita has already described the challenges of maintaining a party identity in relation to oppressive political opponents that want to dissolve the party. But however, I know that in other areas of Southeast Asia, in nations like Indonesia, politicians like Jokowi have publicly supported Prabowo Subianto, a previous political opponent in the last election, given in part because his son was the vice president. So my question is, what value does party loyalty have to democracy, and how can it benefit or take away from its value?
Thank you. Okay. Who wants to go first? And
I don't want to monopolize the conversation, so if you guys can go. Otherwise, I have to go. For BRICS. So for BRICS, the fact is this, so it's Malaysia and Thailand. And the second fact is Thailand is also trying to join OECD at the same time. So it's probably, there's some benefits to it, but it's more like a symbolic gesture that they are starting for the entrance procedure at the same time. Yeah, for some, if they don't do it together, it might seem like a maneuver of choosing sides, but then again, because they apply to OECD at the same time as BRICS, and it's only the beginning of the process, it's too soon to analyze. But I felt like if we were to find a natural partner of choice, ASEAN and Australia would be something of concrete benefits, because it's not about sides. It's about values together. It's about going back to the rule-based world order, where foreign policy is an a la carte and not a buffet. It's very imposing for great powers to make us choosing sides as if foreign policy is a buffet. Like if I go for this side, for this camp, I have to agree with everything they say or the other ways. But it's it's the ability to choose, values by values, transaction by transaction, and see how it benefits both the countries that I'm working with. It's more like playing poker and not chess, because we're not, pawns of just two players, but being able to call out bluffs with guardrails of things, and with the equal play with one another is probably the right way to do it. The second one was about Australian role. You guys can help me out on this. Australian role in helping ASEAN so that they can synergize and become the middle power. No? No? No?
Okay, I can give a step, given that I've been advocating for Australia's engagement with Southeast Asia for a long time. I think Australia's actually on a very good trajectory in doing so, especially with the recent, continuous, but also more recent. Pita mentioned the special summit that had just happened in March, another high mark in the relationship, being the first ASEAN dialogue partners. So Australia has been there in the region, and what matters is consistency. That's, I think, regardless of governments, regardless of policies, or the current geopolitical or geo-economic challenges of the day. I think Australia does have this continuous recognition that it is a part of a broader region where its interest and connection with ASEAN or Southeast Asia is intrinsic, then being there matters. And we can talk about details of how and what initiatives, but what matters is consistency, I think, and that has been acknowledged. I mean, there is a little bit more popular narrative that it's not enough, it's not enough. It's never going to be enough. But Australia is doing relatively well in comparison to others in the region, and that matters. I mean, for the capacity it has, and I think that most of the region does trust Australia as a middle power that has some similar interest, maybe perhaps more aligned with the US, but it is an actor on its own, and that's the most important thing.
You have to tell the Prime Minister that there's a Prime Ministerial candidate of Thailand who listens to him. 2 billion Australian dollars on financing, 222 in terms of water security in the Mekong region, 69 for the environmental and climate resilience. I mean, these are substantive help that is coming from the summit. So it's not just meetings with no outcomes. It's very substantive, and we appreciate it very much in the sense that it gives not Thailand, actually, it gives Cambodia and Laos the alternative financing so that they don't have to go through that trap diplomacy that they have to rely on the previous alternative that they had. So if they have the alternative, that means they have more autonomy. And once they have autonomy, that's how the ASEAN centrality can happen, like that. The last question is about party identity. Go ahead. I'm moderating.
I was also just going to add that actually Australia has a lot to offer in skills and technological know-how that actually I think a lot of Southeast Asians do not actually, sort of recognize. So the default sort of position is to look at America. And of course, for money, for investment, to look for China. But, what are the main problems in Southeast Asia, right? I mean, it's huge population and diversity and so on. So one is food production. Australia has, advanced technologies, in food, including rice production, actually. We have that in the University of Melbourne. Yeah.
Most productive per hectare.
That's right. Okay. We have expertise in renewable energy. That's going to be, well, it has to be one of the major challenges in the region, right? We have expertise in things like health systems, although that is in decline here. But given, the world has just experienced a pandemic, sustainable, sort of coherent and effective health systems are things that I think will be needed across the region. And in fact, Australia has an interest in making sure that that does exist in Southeast Asia because pandemics don't know borders, right? So if you've got pandemics in Southeast Asia, it's going to come to Australia. So just quickly, and you wanted me to answer the political loyalty question. Well, the thing is, across Southeast Asia, and I'm not talking about the Communist Party is a different dynamic, but political parties in Southeast Asia have mainly been amalgamations of patronage networks. They have not been run by ideology or programs. And therefore, it is very easy for anybody to just hop around different parties, right? And I think that is the problem in Indonesia. That has been the problem in the Philippines. You can't tell the difference of the parties in terms of, let's say, environmental policy. Can you tell the difference between them? You can't. And of course, in Thailand, maybe the Move Forward Party is a breath of fresh air. But we do know that, in the past, the Thai Rak Thai party really represented a move by, the interests of, business and politicians and so on around the Thaksin clique to actually challenge the power of more established political and economic networks. So rather than being programmatic or ideological, it's about battles between patronage networks. And that's why it's easy to just hop around.
Thank you, Vedi.
For me, it's political integrity over party loyalty in a transparent world, in a world full of digital footprint. So I feel like, it's not the same anymore.
Well, that was extraordinary, and I'm not even going to attempt to sum up what was discussed. It was very wide-ranging and very stimulating, but just maybe a couple of observations before I ask you to join me in thanking our keynote speaker and our panel. First of all, Khun Pita, you talked about the themes that were explored in the 50th anniversary summit here, and you mentioned 4 out of the 5 themes. The one pillar that you didn't mention was the Emerging Leaders Dialogue, which I thought was quite pertinent to the theme about the role of youth and young people, which AsiaLink happened to be the organisation that was given the gift of managing that. And we had an extraordinary group of emerging leaders from the region as well as from Australia who talked about many, many things, who learned from one another. And that brings me to the next theme. I think it is clear that our future, our respective futures, Australia and Southeast Asia as a region, looking at institutional collaboration with ASEAN, but as a region, our futures are inextricably entwined. And that is incredibly important. That's why we wanted to have our first major event on the future of Southeast Asia and democracy, because it is quite clear that our futures, our respective futures, are very well entwined, and in a way that we can. And how do we manage that? And how do we not circumvent politics, and democracy, but how do we work together to learn from one another and to share values? I think it is very much tied up with the thematic collaboration to meet some of our common challenges, whether they be in the environment or on the health system, water management, all the things that, if not addressed, will generate a kind of conflict and will make it easier for authoritarian regimes to take charge if there is a lot of civil dissatisfaction and dissent. By building collaboration, by building economic collaboration, where we build one another's futures and prosperity, is going to have to make a difference, I think, to stability. And that's what has been really the sub-theme, I think, of today's discussion. And finally, to say, we at AsiaLink and the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne, we all bemoan the fact that we don't have enough discussion to understand the complexities of what our economic and political futures are as individual countries in a region, as democracies or other regimes. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to launch this series, really to expand the conversation, to get ideas from people, to have an opportunity to talk to one another, to explore, to learn from one another through this incredibly knowledgeable panel today. And I think we've certainly met our KPIs, Michael, in that regard. So I want to say thank you to, well, first of all, Khun Pita, for coming here, spending time with us. You've got an extraordinary... Your idealism, courage, but also your pragmatism, I think, is an inspiration for us all. And thank you to our fabulous panel, mostly from the University of Melbourne. But I think what is wonderful to see is how diverse and knowledgeable the people we have here in Australia who think and talk about these things, and who can also help us understand the region and the future of Australia and its relationship with the region, including the theme for tonight, which is the future of democracy in Southeast Asia. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's been wonderful, and we look forward to seeing you at the next series, when it's arranged later on this year. Thank you.